This is our second lesson in ancient history. I don't know if you have your notes from the first lesson. You don't have them with you, do you, by any chance? Do you? If you have them, look at them because it'll be helpful. If you don't have them, it's okay, because I'm going to give a quick review of what we did in the first lesson and then go back over things and get through chapter 1. So, here's what I want you to understand. We have to ask the question, where did we come from? What happened in the world before we were born? When did man arrive? Who were the first people that ever lived? Where did they live? When did they live? How did they live? On and on. We ask these questions. We have to go back, and we continue to go back, and we continue to go back. And the question is, how far can we go back? How far can we go back? How long have men been alive on earth? What we talked about in the last lesson was that if we look at written human records, evidence goes back to around 3,500 BC. Remember that from World Chronology class, right? Around 3,500, 3,000 BC. Sometime around there we have the Sumerian civilization, and we have the oldest preserved sources of human records, written information, no earlier than 3,500 years before Christ. And follow me on, look at me on this, because I want to make sure this is clear. When we talk about history, when you use the word history, it means the time since the beginning of human written records. Okay? So 3,500 BC, that's the beginning of history. Even this textbook will admit that that's the beginning of history. It'll refer to it as the dawn of history. Okay? Anything before that, we talked about this in the first lesson, anything that people say existed, any human activity that we talk about or that anyone talks about before 3,500 BC is theory. Or it has to be based on some evidence other than human records, because there are no human records, no written human records before 3,500 BC. That's not my theory. That's not my opinion. Even this textbook will make that clear. Before 3,500 BC, there is no human history. Now, what we're talking about in this first lesson is a theory. It's a theory that's known as prehistory. Prehistory. Let's get going. That's enough. Let's get going. Pay attention. In this lesson, in chapter 1 of this ancient history textbook, we're learning about a theory of prehistory. Just look how silly this word is. And I'm going to be critical because I do not believe in this theory, and I do not believe it should be given the respect that it's given. The name itself is ridiculous. We're talking about prehistory, before history. Before there are any human records, we have a theory of what happened before there were ever any human records. And we actually refer to this as prehistory. So if you hear the word prehistoric, it means before 3,500 BC. That's prehistoric. And this first chapter of our textbook is an example of the best scholars in the world, archaeologists, geologists, historians, trying as hard as they can to produce some kind of explanation for their theory that man has actually lived for millions of years. All right? We might say that that sounds ridiculous. There's no written records of man living beyond 3,500 BC, and yet these men, because of the theory of evolution, which they're committed to the theory of evolution, they have to believe that men have lived for millions of years. Do you understand that? In order for the theory of evolution to be true, men must have lived for millions of years. You understand that? So the theory of evolution, because they're so committed, for some reason, they're so committed to the theory of evolution that they have to create a story that explains how men could have lived for millions of years on Earth and left no written records. And they refer to this as prehistory. History before there's any record of history. And if we look at these dates, we'll find that there are 3 dates that have this word lithic in them. What lithic means is Stone Age. You've heard of the Stone Age, the Ice Age, the Bronze Age, right? Lithic means Stone Age. Paleo means old. Meso means middle. And neo means new. So Paleolithic means the old Stone Age. Mesolithic means the middle Stone Age. And Neolithic means the new Stone Age. And then after the Neolithic Age, the Stone Age ends. So all 3 of these are the Stone Age, 3 different periods of the Stone Age, and then the Bronze Age. This is theory. This is theory. Now, these ancient archaeologists, geologists, historians, they're really philosophers trying to persuade people of their theory of the world. They try desperately to put together a story that makes sense, that's even possible. They try to put together a story, but I'll give you a challenge. If you go on the internet and you search for these words, Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic Age, you look them up on the internet when you have some time, and I challenge you to tell me when the dates are for these ages. Every page you look at will have different dates. You'll never be able to, the dates don't even make sense. They overlap, they cross. If you look at the dates, the Paleolithic Age is said to have started like 3 million years ago. All that men had were simple, the reason it's called the Stone Age is because they had stone tools. They had simple, like caveman stone tools. And the Paleolithic, or the first part of the Stone Age, is said to have started in like 3 million BC and continued all the way through 10,000 BC. So for 3 million years, man had nothing but crude stone tools. 3 million years, according to this theory. Then, all of a sudden in 10,000 BC, the tools got a little bit better. Then they got a little bit better in a couple thousand years. And then suddenly there was the Bronze Age, which they'll date back to 3000 BC, even though the Neolithic Age is said to go on to 1900 BC. The Mesolithic Age is said to go to 20. The dates never line up. There's no way to make sense, clear sense out of the theory. It's just all over the place. But man lived with stone tools until 3000 BC, then all of a sudden developed bronze tools and started writing. 3000 BC, because this is the time when not prehistory, but real history begins. Okay? So for 3 million years, man stayed in one condition, using crude stone tools. And then from 10,000 BC to 3000 BC, after 3 million years of no change, he suddenly went from crude stone to bronze and writing. And from 3000 BC to 2000 BC, we now have space travel, wireless internet. So 3 million years, virtually no development. And then within 5,000 years, we go from creating a bronze tool and starting the first records of writing to sending rockets into space and having wireless internet and... Okay? 5,000 years from the beginning of writing to where we are today. But before that, we're to believe that there were 3 million years of no records. When you look at this theory, now these are people who would criticize a Catholic explanation of history. They would accuse us of being superstitious, religious, not caring about science, not caring about facts, and so on. To accept this, you have to believe that man did not develop for 3 million years. And then all of a sudden, in the last 5,000 years, kaboom. Or, if you believe the traditional Catholic view of the history of the world and the origin of men, you believe that God created men around 4000 BC. He created them with understanding, with reason, with all of these powerful gifts of intellect, and in 5,000 years, he's done what we see today. Which of the two is more credible? 3,000 years of no development, followed by 5,000 years of explosive development, or simply 5,000 years of explosive development? Okay? I don't mean to be disrespectful to this theory, but first of all, it is just a theory, and second, I don't believe that the people who hold this theory can even make a good case for it. Like I said, I challenge you to just tell me when the dates for these ages are, according to these historians. You can go on 4 different websites and get 4 different sets of dates. This textbook we have here, this is the Cambridge Ancient History, the greatest history textbook series that exists. They won't even pretend to have dates for these events because there's just no way. All right? But this, I want you to understand, this is the theory. Do you understand this? That there were 3 million years called the Stone Age. That's what lithic means. Men simply had stone tools, didn't write, were like cavemen. And then all of a sudden, bronze was discovered, and within 1,000 years, you've got literature. Within 2,000 years, you've got the Psalms of King David and the Proverbs of Solomon and temples and all these things. And today we've got space travel and modern science, wireless communication, on and on. Electric cars. I just don't believe that it's a credible theory, but it is a theory. And in this textbook, this first chapter is dedicated to this theory. So I'd like to go through this chapter. I'd like to take one lesson, just this lesson, to walk you through this first chapter. We're not going to go through the details because, like I said, even if you read it, it's just all theory. There's no evidence provided. There's no demonstration or proof. It's just a story that explains this theory of the early history of the world. So let's just walk through the text a little bit. Actually, before I do that, I made an outline up here of the 8 different sections of this chapter. Okay, so this is a long chapter. It's like 50 pages. It's 50 or so pages, but what I want you to see is that there are 8 sections, 8 topics covered in this first chapter. The first chapter is called Setting the Stage, and it talks about how do we learn about history. It says we can look at human records, but that's only good for like 5,000 years. So what are we going to do? And then they are forced to say that, well, only the archaeologist and the geologist can help us. And I talked about that in our first lesson. And so this whole theory depends upon theories based upon archaeology and geology. And do you remember what I said the problem with archaeology is? Do you remember? I said the problem with archaeology is that you can dig stuff up. You can dig up old cities. You can dig up all kinds of stuff. But what's the problem? You have to interpret those things. You have to explain what they are. You have to explain when they were used, what they did, why they were used. And as soon as you get into interpretation, we have no idea. So archaeology doesn't give us any clear answers. We have to have clear answers so that we can explain what the stuff is that we find in archaeology. Do you understand that? And so it really doesn't help us. People who believe one thing interpret it one way. People who believe another thing interpret it another way. It doesn't solve any of the problems. So that first section is about setting the stage, how we can learn about man's history, how we need to study through archaeology and geology. Basic stuff we talked about last class. Then we get into the actual theory, pre-glacial geography, and I talked about this a little bit. What was the world like in this ancient time? Right? We talked about how the theory is that the continents and the seas moved and changed over time. Right? Now, the reason why we have to be critical is because when we read the book of Genesis, when we read Genesis chapter 1, which we believe is divine revelation, it says that God gathered the seas together and caused the dry land to appear. Right? That's what it says in Genesis 1. It says that God said, "Let the waters be gathered together and let the dry land appear." And the waters he called seas, and the dry land he called earth. So Scripture teaches us that that's something that God did at the time of creation. He made the seas and he made the dry land. It doesn't tell us, it doesn't suggest that the land and the seas were constantly changing. The land was constantly moving and changing shape. The seas were changing and moving all around. It doesn't suggest that idea of the world to us. It suggests that God established the lands, God established the locations of the seas, and that's how they were. And from the beginning of Genesis, it talks to us about the earth as if what the earth was like in the beginning is just like what it is like now. Right? You never read a Bible story where countries disappear and the earth changes and seas disappear and there's new seas. We don't read anything like that in Scripture. Scripture never suggests to us that the land and the seas moved and changed and anything like that. So this is a theory that does not have any source or support from the Bible. And that's important. They believed that there were different phases or ages of the earth when the shape of the land and the seas changed. They believed that the geography before this glacial crisis, when the earth became very cold and was covered with ice, this sort of ice age, changed the shape of the land and the seas, forced animals and plants and people to move all over the place. They believed that there was a glacial crisis. There's no way to prove this. And they talk about what the world was like before this glacial crisis. Then they talk in the chapter here about the principal human races, which I talked about in our first lesson. There are 3 basic human races, which are basically white people, yellow people, and black people, right? They live in 3 different parts of the earth, and they have different characteristics, and there's all of this evolutionary explanation for why they're different. Then we talk about here, you see Paleolithic man, right? Paleolithic man. Man living in the Old Stone Age. That's the 5th topic in this first chapter. Then we get into this discussion of the Ice Age in the Near East. That means in the land of Israel, Egypt, Persia. That's the Near East. The Ice Age in Europe. And then the last section of chapter 1 is the end of the Old Stone Age, which is the Paleolithic Age. Okay? So chapter 1 is about the Paleolithic Age and before. Or I guess just the Paleolithic Age, because it's millions of years old, right? So chapter 1 is about the Paleolithic Age, and then when we get to chapter 2, it starts talking about the Neolithic Age. All right? So when you read chapter 1, which is going to take some time, what I want you to do in your notes, is use this list as an outline for your notes. And remember, you don't have to copy this off the board because it's in your book. You see, if you look on the first page of our lesson, it says Primitive Man in Geological Time, Part 1, Setting the Stage. You see that? So this outline is in your book. And what I'd like you to do when you read the chapter, I'd like you to use this as your outline and just fill in some details that you read about in each section. Okay? Got that? And we're going to walk through a little bit of it together. So now that you have a good idea of the outline of this first chapter, and you see the theory that's being presented in this chapter, let's just walk through the chapter. Did you set the timer this time? How far are we?
22 minutes.
22, okay. So let's just spend 40 minutes walking through chapter 1. We'll get through as much as we can, and that's really all we're going to do. And then I'm going to ask you to read through it on your own, take notes, and our goal for the study of this chapter, you're going to find it I assume you're going to find it difficult to follow and difficult to take seriously. It's a theory. They're trying to put this theory together. There's really no credibility to it, no real evidence that they can offer us. But I want you to read it because people who believe in evolution believe in this theory of prehistory. Do you all understand that? People who believe in evolution, when you say the earth is billions of years old, that sounds cute. When you say I believe that species evolved from one into another, that sounds cute. It's safe to say that, but you have to explain, where was man when all this evolution was going on? Where was man? Where does man show up? Where can you prove that man began to exist? That's the challenge for evolution, and this is their attempt to answer that question. And I want you to judge if you think it's a credible answer or not. This is their answer for where man was as the world evolved. Okay, so let's just walk through chapter 1 here. Part 1, setting of the stage, we're going to skip over that because we've already talked about that. But I'd like you to look at the bottom of the first page. Look at the bottom of the first page. You'll see, if you go 3 lines up, you'll see the sentence that starts, "To recover what men were doing." Do you see that? Bottom of the first page of chapter 1. It's the 3rd line up. To recover what men were doing or making, still more what they were thinking or desiring. And look what it says, before the dawn of history. So they're admitting that there was no history before 3500 BC. They say, before the dawn of history. To recover what men were doing, it says, the sole available method, this is right at the bottom of the page, the sole available method is that of the archaeologist. In other words, we have to dig it up. And then on the top of the next page, merging in the work of the geologist, the man who studies the earth. So this evolutionary theory of the world, this theory of prehistory, is not supported by any human records. And in order for it to be created, in order for it to be put together, it has to be created by archaeologists and geologists who explain what they can find and see in the earth so that they can weave this story together of what happened before history. Are you following what I'm explaining? Is it clear what I'm saying? Okay. So the whole discussion about this prehistoric world, this whole discussion is only necessary because men are trying so hard to promote this theory of evolution. And the obvious question is, where is man in this theory of evolution? And this is their attempt, with no written records, to try to dig up the earth and study the rocks to put together a story that can explain where man might be, or where man might have come from, or what man might have been doing for the 3 million years before he ever wrote anything down. Okay? So at the bottom of page 1, you have that important little statement where it says, to recover this prehistory, we have to rely completely on archaeology and geology. And we talked about what the problems are with archaeology and geology and why they can never give us any certainty about the history of the world. They can't. We're going to look down to the bottom of page 2. We have another important little sentence or two. Down at the bottom of page 2, do you see the paragraph that begins, to see how the stage was set? To see how the stage was set for this pageant, we must look back beyond the moment when the first characters enter it. For it has been nature rather than man that has determined where the action shall lie. So this prehistoric theory tells us that man actually isn't important. And when we demand to know where was man in the prehistoric world, the answer is, it doesn't really matter. Man's not that important. That's the answer. But that's a pretty ridiculous answer. Man is the chief creature on earth, at least for a Christian worldview. Why would I be interested in studying the history of the world if there were no men in it? As a man, am I going to study the history of fish? Or the history of rocks? I want to know about the history of man because, like we said, our goal in studying history, it's not that we're bored, we don't have anything to do. We want to learn from human experiences so that we can live well in our own life. To see how the stage was set, in other words, to be able to create this explanation of history before history, we actually have to move beyond man, because there's no evidence of man, and look at nature through archaeology and geology to determine where the action shall lie. So they're not even pretending to study some history of man. They're studying or pretending to study the earth itself, as if there was some time when the earth existed either without man or where man was almost non-existent on the earth. So from there, let's go down to the second part of this chapter. This is the bottom of page 28 in the document. The second section, titled Pre-Glacial Geography. So what did they think the earth was like? What did they think the earth was like before history? In this prehistoric world, what did they think the world was like? In this second section, we get a description. This theory explains for us what the world was like. We're told that the continents and the seas were all shaped differently. Let me just find the section right here. It's actually the bottom of page 29. The bottom of page 29, you'll see a paragraph that begins with the chalk. See if you can find that paragraph. Bottom of page 29 in the document, the chalk. And this is where the explanation of this geography of the world before history comes from. The chalk, the white stone, the chalk which composes the white walls of England, on the coast of England, the massive limestones of the hills which stand around Jerusalem, and the gray limestone which gives its wilder grace to the landscape of Greece. So we find some white stone in England, we have some gray stone in Greece, and we have some white stone in Jerusalem. So we conclude that because these areas all have the same stone, they must have all at one time been part of this ancient sea. And that's why they have this stone of the same kind in these different places. Because of this white stone that we can see in England, in Greece, and in Jerusalem, they were formed by deposits on the floor of a great prehistoric sea which covered everything. So that white stone was once at the bottom of some prehistoric sea. In the next sentence it says, this sea, to which geologists give the name of Tethys, and I want you to remember that name, Tethys. Tethys is the Great Sea. You know how we have the Mediterranean Sea? It's a large sea in the middle of the earth. They believed that if you take the Mediterranean Sea and multiply it by 10, there was this giant sea that stretched across the center of the earth, and it was called Tethys. This sea, which geologists give the name of Tethys, belongs to the second of the three great schemes or ages of oceans and continents, whose distribution can be distinguished in the long course of the Earth's history. The sea, Tethys, remember what the word Tethys means. It's the name of that prehistoric great sea that stretched across the earth, according to this theory. That sea, Tethys, had taken its shape. So where did that sea come from? As a result of a period, listen to this, of planetary convulsion. That means some kind of catastrophic events that rocked the planet and created this giant sea in the prehistoric world. This brought an end to the first phase of this ancient prehistoric time, and the sea was obliterated with the exception of the Mediterranean Sea, the Caspian Sea, and the Caribbean Sea. So that sea Tethys was destroyed by some event that took place on Earth, and the seas which we have today, the Mediterranean Sea, the Caspian Sea, and the Caribbean Sea, were left behind like puddles after the great ancient sea was destroyed. Then it explains that the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans today, if you look at a globe, if you look at a map, the Atlantic Ocean stretches from the North Pole all the way down to the South Pole. Right? Can you picture that on a map? The Atlantic Ocean goes all the way from north to south. And the Pacific Ocean does the same thing. It's from Alaska all the way down to the bottom of South America, all the way over to Australia. Right? They stretch, the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean stretch from north to south. Right? This sea, Tethys, stretched the other way, from west to east, across the whole earth. All right? It ended in the land of Asia to the east and west all the way to what we now call the Pacific Ocean. This was their theory of the world. Okay, so that's what I want you to see. The basic idea is that this prehistoric theory argues that the shape of the continents and the seas all changed in prehistoric times, right? And the world as it looks today, there's no use going and looking for stuff because the whole entire world changed, according to this prehistoric theory. So if we say, where was man? You can explain it away and say, well, it's impossible to tell because the whole entire world changed. And the proof for this is that there's white stone in England and there's white stone in Jerusalem. Right? And that's what he explained. Because there's common stone, that must mean that that was once the bottom of a great sea. And this is an example of what I talked about in biology class. That's a terrible conclusion to draw from the observations, right? To say that because there's white stone here and there's white stone here, they must have one time be joined together. What if there's just white stone in two different places, right? It's like if I find a size 10 Nike left shoe in China and I find a Nike size 10 right shoe in Brazil, it means the same guy was in both places and he lost one shoe in China and one shoe in Brazil. Is that proven by the fact that I find these two shoes? No. Is it possible? Yeah, it's possible. Kind of ridiculous, but possible. But that's not a reasonable conclusion to draw from that observation. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Just because you have a possible explanation does not mean your conclusion has been proven. A possible explanation is not proof. All it is a possible explanation, and there could be a million. You can make a million ridiculous conclusions. So, the existence of a possible explanation is not proof. That's what you have to understand. It doesn't prove it. The fact that you have white stone in England and in Greece and in Jerusalem does not prove that there was once a giant sea that covered all those lands. Is it possible? Is it possible? Yes. But is it proven? No. Okay? So that's what I want you to see in that second section. There's an explanation of the geography of this prehistoric world, and he goes into more details. But what I want you to look at is there is a page where there's some drawings. I'll tell you the page number. Let me find it. We're just going to skip ahead to this. Page 41 in the document. Page 41. It's a very, very crummy page. The illustrations are not very clear. But I want you to look at it. If you start at the top left, the argument is that's what the ancient world was like, the early prehistoric world. You can see how there are big black land masses and everything else is water. Can you see that? And then if you go down, you can see how the land changes shape. And then if you go up to the right, back up to the top, you can see how it continues to change shape and continues as you go down until you finally get to the bottom. The bottom right is basically what the world is like in modern time. So do you see that? That's the theory. Those drawings illustrate the theory of how the continents and the bodies of water changed over time. Basically as the earth evolved, as the geography of the earth evolved. From this ancient world, this prehistoric world where this great sea of Tethys covered the earth, to how the different continents emerged so that we find the world as it is today. Is there evidence of this? It's not provided by the author, so it makes it very difficult for us to judge. Is this explanation possible? Sure. We'll grant to this author that this is a possible explanation, that this theory, if this explanation was in fact true, might be believable. But first of all, we're starting with a theory, then we're using the theory to create a story. We don't have any demonstrative evidence, any evidence that proves that this is true. So all we have is a possible story that tells us what we have to say if we want to believe in evolution. If you want to believe in evolution, here's a way to explain it that can basically get you out of trouble if people ask you questions. And that's what this is. It's an attempt to try to make an explanation by people and for people who want, for some reason, to believe in the theory of evolution. So you have on that page there, do you all see that picture, that page with the pictures on it? And you see how it kind of changes shape and grows into what the world looks like today on the bottom right? Okay? So if you read through that chapter and read through that section on the geography, you can look at that page and look at the illustrations and get an idea of what the author is trying to describe as he explains it. So let's keep moving here. We then talk about the glacial crisis that takes place. There's a theory that the earth became very cold, that the northern and southern lands froze, and it forced everyone to the center of the earth. Again, this is all theory. And he talks about how that might have changed, how the lands were formed and where man might have lived, where animals and plants might have lived. So you can read through that and learn about the glacial crisis. In section 4, we see an explanation of the principal human races, which I've already talked about. I think you'll find that interesting to read. I don't necessarily know that contradicts anything biblical to say that there's three main races of people, because in the Bible you have this idea of Noah's 3 sons, right? So it kind of seems to be a parallel and compare to the biblical story that all the nations of the earth came from 3 people, right? Do you understand how those can kind of be made to agree that the world came from 3 people? But again, one of you said the other day, didn't all the races develop after the Tower of Babel? There's still questions to ask, okay? But read through that section. about the principal human races and why there are three different races, why people have different characteristics in different areas of the world. That's a very interesting question to explore and study. Move through section 4. We get to section 5. Let's get down to section 5. Paleolithic man in the south. Paleolithic man in the south and east. Give me 1 minute. I just lost my page. Paleolithic man in the south and east. Get back there. Okay, that's page 54 in our document. So that is Old Stone Age man before 10,000 BC living in the south and east. So that's like Asia, India, in the prehistoric world. Okay? Paleolithic man. Sort of caveman, stone tool, living in the lands that we would consider Asia today, in that Paleolithic prehistoric period. What was life like in that period for the quote-unquote yellow-skinned people, right? That's section 5. Let's move down to section 6. This is a long chapter, and you'll see there's very little evidence for anything that's discussed. In section 6, we get into this discussion of the Ice Age. So if you want to learn about the Ice Age and what these evolutionary historians teach about the Ice Age, section 6 of chapter 1, remember, this is all this prehistoric stuff. So the whole idea of an Ice Age, is there any Ice Age in the Bible? There's no Ice Age, right? There's no talk about the earth freezing or Ice Age. There's no cavemen in the Bible. We can ask the question, are there any dinosaurs in the Bible? Is that also just a theory, or is there actual evidence of that? So there's a lot of questions to ask, because if we read the Bible from Genesis, where man is created, where the world is created, we don't see Stone Ages and Ice Ages. We don't see all of these things that we read about in this prehistoric theory. Was there actually an Ice Age? It makes for a funny cartoon, right? It's a funny comedy show to watch the Ice Age and think about the world covered with ice. But was the world actually ever covered with ice? Just because we have glaciers and the North and South poles are covered with ice, we can conclude that there were times where the whole Earth was covered with ice? If there is, and this is supposed to be science, what does science need to do? What does science need to do? If they want to claim that this is scientific, they need to prove it, right? Science is about observation. They need to prove this. So you can read about the Ice Age, and I challenge you to find any proof. And if you find proof, I want you to share it with me. I want you to show me what the author offers us to prove that there was an Ice Age in the world. All right, let's keep walking through the chapter. So the Ice Age in the Near East. Then we move down, we have the Ice Age in Europe. Okay, we have an explanation for how Europe became covered with ice and how it affected life in the Northwest. And when they talk about Europe, they're usually talking about the white race of people. So how did the Ice Age affect the white people? That's section 7. And then the last section, you have an illustration there, on page 70. If you look at page 70 in the document, it's sideways, so you have to look at it sideways. But you'll see a diagram or an illustration showing you what the Ice Age geography might have looked like. Okay? Your browser might have a button that allows you to rotate the image. You can try rotating it. Oops. Mine doesn't let me do that. But anyway, you have an image there of the Ice Age. And there's a little, if you look under where it says the Ice Age, you have an explanation for what the different colors and shadings show you on the map. And it's not the best quality. It's an old book, but That's an explanation of what the world might have looked like according to this theory of the Ice Age, okay? And then we move on a little further down to section 8 on page 75 of the document, which is the close of the Old Stone Age, the close of the Paleolithic world, which supposedly took place sometime around 10,000 BC, 7,000 or 6,000 years before there's any evidence of human life on Earth. The close of the Old Stone Age. All right? And that brings us to the end of this first chapter. Where are we at time-wise?
50 minutes.
50?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. So what I want you to see in all of this is really great to compare with our study in biology class. Because today we talked about the role of experimenting in biology. Remember, there were 3 parts of an experiment. The first part was to make the experiment. The second part was to collect observations. And the third part was to draw conclusions. We see that there's a problem that these scientists are trying to solve. And we can respect them. I want to make sure that you understand that when I criticize someone's theory, I'm not being disrespectful. They have the right to propose theories and go and conduct experiments and try to prove that it's true or false, to test their theories, right? They have the right to do this. That's how science works. You can see that there's a problem. We're trying to explain the history of the Earth, right? We have a question. We have an experiment, and the experiment that they're conducting is pretty amazing. These archaeologists and geologists are studying the whole Earth, literally going places and drilling through the Earth, digging through the Earth, digging up cities, and looking for evidence that can help them put together a story and test their theory. That's respectable. Their efforts to experiment, their efforts to go out and observe nature itself, that's respectable. That's what they should be doing as scientists. The second part of an experiment is to collect and record observations. And we can see even in this book, a lot of those observations have been recorded for us, right? That's what this first chapter is filled with, observations that people have made. That's good. That's how science works. But the third part of experimentation is drawing conclusions. And that's where I disagree with these theories. I do not believe that the evidence that they that they share with us, I don't think it supports the conclusions that they draw from it. Do you understand that? I can't say that it's false. I can't say that this is all false and impossible. I can't say it's impossible. Right? I don't know. But what I can say is the conclusions that they draw from their evidence is not convincing. It doesn't prove their theory to be true. And just because their theory might be possible, that doesn't mean that it's scientific. It's not proven. It's not fact. It's just a theory. Okay? And if a theory contradicts divine revelation, I don't think that we should respect it unless they can prove it. And that's the problem with this prehistoric theory. All right, so that's an overview of chapter 1. I really would like for you to read the chapter. I would really like for you to learn. This is an important skill for college and future studies. I would really like for you to learn to read the arguments of a person whose theory you might not believe is true. I'd like you to read the arguments he makes for this prehistoric theory. Do you understand that? We have to learn we have to learn to listen to other people's arguments. When someone has an idea that we don't agree with, we can learn a lot by listening to their explanation of why they believe what they believe. It doesn't mean that it's going to persuade us, but it's important for us to listen so we can understand why they believe what they believe. Okay? If we're not willing to listen, then they're actually going to tell us that we're afraid to listen because we know we'll be persuaded. You see how that's like a kind of works like a trick, right? Oh, you know why you won't read my book? Because you know it's going to convert you to my opinion. And so by being willing to study what they write and listen to their explanations, we can prove that A, we're not afraid of any scientific theories, we're not afraid of any arguments, we're not afraid of any evidence. We're willing to listen to both sides of the story, and we're going to seek to know what's wrong about their theory. Okay? So you have to learn to be willing to listen to other people's sides of the story, other people's arguments, just like in a court case. Both sides of the case get to speak, and the judge listens to both sides. No matter what the judge thinks, he listens to both sides. He gives both sides the opportunity to present their case, and then he makes the decision based on the evidence, right? We have to be the judge in all of these different issues. But to be a good judge, you have to listen to both sides. And so I'd like you to take the time to read through this. It's a lot of reading, but it's historical reading. And you have to learn to just read through historical reading quickly. Okay? Do you understand that? When you do that, complete the assessment in the lesson and finish lesson 1 in ancient history. In our next class, we're going to move on to chapter 2. And we're going to quickly get into real history. Okay? So this is just like one chapter, maybe 2 chapters of this prehistoric stuff, and then it's all over. We're into real human history. Okay? So that's lesson 1 of ancient history.